Welcome to the Buddhistisches Tor Berlin podcast. Here we share talks and reflections from our Buddhist Center in Berlin, exploring themes such as meditation, ethics, and the path of awakening in everyday life. We are part of the Triratna Buddhist Community, and our talks are offered freely in a spirit of generosity. We hope this episode supports your practice and your life.
So, it's wonderful to be here again. So the last time I sat here with you was in January 2025, so a bit more than a year ago. And it was 2 days later that I went on my second journey, a journey to India, my second journey to Nepal. And at that point, I think Sangharakshita asked me if I would maybe in the future come back to share my experience. So I feel like there was an open promise, and I really want to keep my promise. So this is what I thought I'd talk about today. And I don't not just want to talk about my own journey, but about 3 different journeys, as you will see, which are all in some ways interwoven and interconnected. So the first journey is the journey of the Buddha and everything that unfolded from his experience and what we now call Buddhism. And then the second journey is the journey of Sangharakshita, a young Englishman who in the 1940s came to India to search for the Buddha and to search for Buddhism. And he ended up staying in the East for 20 years before he went back to the UK to found our community, this community, the Triratna Buddhist Community. And then the third journey is my own journey in the footsteps of these 2 men, which I did a year ago. And I had to limit myself to 3 places, otherwise I probably could be sitting here and talking for a long time. But I not only want to talk about a physical or historical journey, I also want to talk about how being on a journey is relevant for all of us here. So in a sense, we are all pilgrims on the journey of our lives. So I also want to explore pilgrimage as a practice or maybe an attitude towards life. And I think this is especially appropriate if we are living a Dharma life and aspiring to follow in the footsteps of the Buddha. So where does our journey begin? Where does Buddhism begin? And geographically, this is in a place called Bodh Gaya in northeast India. And this is also where my journey to India, my trip started last year in Bodh Gaya. And I want to invite you to imagine this place in your imagination. So Bodh Gaya is in a very poor state called Bihar in the Indian countryside. There are plains of dust and sand and a few rice fields, some very simple villages. And then in that countryside, there is this small town that is full of international visitors. And this small town has at its center a place called the Mahabodhi Temple. And it has a kind of a bit like a stupa-like structure, like this cone and several terraces around it where people come, thousands of pilgrims go there every day, and they come there to make offerings, they come there to recite texts. And many people, especially Tibetan women, they also do full body prostration, and they all in some way circumambulate this temple building, and there's this constant flow of people kind of circumambulating around this center, this very important spiritual center. But the true spiritual center is not the building itself, but the heart is the Bodhi tree. It's a massive, huge tree. And why is this place so important? So in the Buddhist tradition, this place is called the seed of awakening. And it is the place where the Buddha woke up. So where he became a Buddha, and this is what Buddha means. The Buddha means somebody who is awake, who has woken up. After having been on a journey to find the truth for 7 years. So this happened 2,500 years ago. And what happened? So the Buddha had been, before he was a Buddha, had been searching for the meaning of life. At a young age, he had an encounter and he realized, if we all have to die, if we all have to suffer from getting ill, losing the people that we love, so what's the meaning of life? What's the point of it all? What's the point of enjoying pleasures and buying things, having a comfortable life? What's the point if at the end we just die? And so he went on a journey to find an answer to that question. And in the night of his awakening, the Buddha saw that we all suffer because of losing what we love, and we lose and having to die. But there is a reason for this suffering, and this reason is our blindness. So we are so attached to the world and to the things and our own habits that we just can't see and imagine that we do have the potential to be free within us. So we could be something completely different, and we could also operate in the world from a completely different place. And this inner place is the awakened mind. It's the place that the Buddha attained to, the reality he woke up to. And this awakened mind is a mind that is characterized by limitless wisdom, compassion, and boundless creativity. And it is the only thing that will truly make us happy. So all other things like nice food, a successful career, the perfect partner can only give us very short-term and a limited amount of satisfaction. So if we look for a true source of happiness, we will only able to find it by turning inwards and by transforming our own minds. And when the Buddha woke up and understood all this, so he woke up to the nature of reality, he saw that every one of us in this room has the potential to awaken, and that there's even a clear path that can lead or will lead to awakening. So he reflected on his own experience, and he saw that there were conditions and principles at work that were universal and that make it possible to awaken, to develop this awakened mind. And so the Buddha was a special human being only in the sense that he was the first to rediscover the path to awakening in our times. But his message is that every one of us can attain what he has attained. So in this sense, he's not special. So after the Buddha, like being this 35-year-old man sitting under the tree, had fully absorbed his experience, he began to travel throughout northern India and to tell people about what he had experienced and how they themselves could realize the same. And so many people did actually realize what the Buddha realized. And this was the beginning of Buddhism. And Buddhism is essentially a spiritual communication from an awakened mind to people who, through that communication, can suddenly understand something of the nature of this experience. And it's important that the Buddha not only taught through his words and through what's now kind of been passed on as written literature. He probably much more effectively also communicated through his exemplification and through his presence. And I think a lot of people had a very strong experience by being in the presence of the Buddha and by experiencing his awakened mind. So when the thousands of pilgrims come every day to the Mahabodhi temple to express their devotion, they do that out of gratitude to the Buddha and to all subsequent masters of the Buddhist tradition who have been teaching the path to awakening and thereby made it possible for us to follow in their footsteps. But at the same time, everyone who somehow bows to an image of the Buddha, like, for example, this one, like if we come here and most of us, or some of us, kind of come in and bow to that image, it also is an expression of bowing to the Buddha nature, our own potential within us to become a Buddha and to realize the same awakened mind. So from the seed of awakening in Bodh Gaya, Buddhism, the path that the Buddha taught, spread throughout the world. And this is very visible if one looks around at the different visitors and their different robes and costumes. So they're like traditional Theravadin monks from Sri Lanka in very orange, bright orange robes. And then there are Tibetan monks and nuns in dark red, maroon robes. And you have white lay practitioners from China and people in traditional costumes who are lay practitioners as well, like Tibetan dresses and Westerners. So you can really see like all the different countries to which Buddhism spread are somehow represented when you look around at the people who come to this place. And the very special thing about Bodh Gaya is that it's the only place in the Buddhist world that is revered by all Buddhists equally. So it's important for all Buddhists and all traditions. So the awakening experience of the Buddha is the one experience that unites all schools of Buddhism. So all methods and practices that evolved over the centuries and that might look quite very different from outward looking at it, they aim at that same experience. And it's this experience what gives Buddhism its unity. So in early 1950, the 25-year-old Sangharakshita came to Bodh Gaya for the very first time. And by then he had already lived in the East for 6 years. He had come to India as a soldier, but after the Second World War finished, he deserted the army and spent some years wandering around. And he had known since his teenage years in England that he was a Buddhist, but at that time it was very hard to meet other Buddhists because there were hardly any Buddhists in Europe. And even in India, it took him years to really find proper Buddhists, because Buddhism had basically died out 800 to 900 years earlier, so there was hardly any Buddhism left in India. But he finally managed to find a few monks and get himself ordained in the Theravada tradition. And it is as a newly ordained novice monk that Sangharakshita visits Bodh Gaya for the first time. And so the place that he visited 75 years earlier than me was probably a very different place from the one we find today, even though there's still the same temple. But at Sangharakshita's time, it was still a Hindu place of worship, and the place was owned by Hindus and not by Buddhists. And Sangharakshita is quite frustrated about this. But then he's very moved when he observes the Tibetan pilgrims who come all the way from Tibet, very poor people, very sincere people, but so deeply inspired by the Buddha. that he writes in his memoirs that suddenly through their eyes he can really connect with that experience with the Buddha and the awakening of the Buddha, through their devotion and through their sincerity and faith. And he writes some verses in honor of Bodh Gaya that I want to read to you, because I think they express some of the inspiration he found in that place. So Bodh Gaya, how many people have come to you in the course of ages? How many pilgrim feet have trodden the dust of your groves? How many pairs of hands been joined in silent adoration beneath the wide-spreading boughs of the tree of enlightenment? How many heads touched in profound thanksgiving the edge of the diamond throne, the seat of awakening? Bodh Gaya, how beautiful you are in the morning, with the sunlight streaming on the renovated facade of your great temple, as it rises foursquare against the cloudless blue sky. How beautiful in the evening, when in the shadowy depth of the deserted temple courtyard, 1,000 votive lamps glitter like reflections of the stars. Bodh Gaya, I shall always remember how beautiful you were the first time I saw you, when my heart was young and you made me your own. So I had the great fortune to spend a week in Bodh Gaya, part of an order convention with another 900 order members, most of them Indian, last year. And we also had that possibility to sit under the Bodhi trees in the mornings to meditate there where the Buddha had gained awakening, and celebrate puja, so a devotional ritual in the evenings. And it was truly the absolute highlight of being there. And I think for me what this place evoked was really important, was that it brought me in touch with a deep sense of humility, just seeing myself as being part of this thousands of people coming there to that place. And it felt liberating. So just to see myself, or one of those thousands of people who are part of this flow of dedication, a dedication to serve the Dharma. And so somehow just being part of this common project that unites all who participate in it, and that goes far beyond time and space. So the next stage on our journey is a place called Rajgir, about 70 kilometers north of Bodh Gaya. And it was once the capital of an important kingdom called Magadha. And now there's nothing left of that former glory. It just, at the time of the Buddha, that was really important, but now it's just a very poor countryside. And near the city is a hill or a small mountain called Vulture Peak, and at the top of which the Buddha liked to stay and meditate. And this place is mentioned in some of the earliest texts, but it became even more important in the later tradition that developed centuries after the lifetime of the Buddha. And there is a whole body of important Buddhist texts that are set on the Vulture Peak. So these texts start with the Buddha teaching from that place, and what that means is that in some ways the Buddha was teaching from a place of deep meditation and an experience of wisdom that he encountered in the state of meditation. And in that state of contemplation, he saw that we as human beings have actually no fixed self, that we're just a flow of processes. And it is precisely because of that that we can completely transform and awaken and become Buddhas ourselves. And the most popular of this collection of texts is the Heart Sutra, and some of you will probably know it, those people who've come on retreat with us. But there's another famous sutra, the Lotus Sutra, which was, according to the legends, expounded on the Vulture Peak. And these scriptures are very important for the forms of Buddhism that developed in China and Japan. And so it's not surprising that the people who come here are a lot Far Eastern Buddhists. And when last year Dhammasara, Gunavira, Karunada and me visited Vulture Peak, there was a Chinese guy with us reading Chinese scripture, probably the Lotus Sutra, and there was a group of Koreans with us at the time. And going back 75 years, in spring 1950, Sangharakshita traveled with his teacher Yaktish Kashyap throughout the holy sites that the Buddha had visited in the former kingdom of Magadha. And Yaktish Kashyap was a monk and was Sangharakshita's first Buddhist teacher. And he was a scholar and had been working at the university in Benares teaching the Pali language and Buddhist philosophy. And at that time, Sangharakshita had been living and studying with him for some months and respected him for his profound knowledge. But Yaktish Kashyap had become tired of his life teaching at the university, and so he decided to go on a pilgrimage to the holy sites that the Buddha visited to renew his inspiration and to find a new meaning for his own life. And so they traveled for some weeks and maybe months through the holy places of Magadha. And of all the places that they visit, it is the Vulture Peak that has the greatest impact on Sangharakshita for its spiritual significance. Because it is here and through the scriptures that are associated with this place that the Buddha reveals himself not just as a historical person, but as a universal principle, the principle of awakening. And from that more cosmic perspective, awakening is a possibility that is inherent in our universe. It is inherent in the nature of consciousness. And so from that perspective, the Buddha, who lived as a human being about 2,500 years ago, was not only a Buddha, or he was not the only Buddha. He only rediscovered the path that before him had already been discovered by other Buddhas, and after him there will be other Buddhas, and there are other world systems with more Buddhas existing even today, so it's a world full of Buddhas. And it may be surprising that a young Theravadan monk gets so excited about this grand cosmic vision of Buddhism that is very much part of the later developments of Mahayana Buddhism, to which Chinese and Japanese Buddhism belong. So in contrast, the traditional Theravada relies on the earliest scriptures that present the Buddha as a historical figure. So that's where their focus is, on the Buddha Shakyamuni teaching the people he met in India 2,500 years ago. And those teachings also have a very strong emphasis on becoming a monk or a nun and going forth. But that Sangharakshita gets so excited about this place also reflects his own deeper spiritual inspiration. Because as a young man, it was through Chinese Mahayana texts that Sangharakshita encountered as a teenager that he was a Buddhist and that he had always been a Buddhist. He read those texts and he resonated with them immediately. And even though he became a Theravadan monk, because that was the only form of Buddhism that he encountered in India, he never exclusively identified himself as a Theravada Buddhist. And this is something that is very unique about his approach, that from the beginning of his spiritual life, he always thought of himself as an heir to the entire Buddhist tradition. So from the beginning, he was very much attracted to the universal ideal of Mahayana Buddhism, to gain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. And he writes in his memoirs that when he, on his journey, sat at the platform at Vulture's Peak, where the Buddha used to sit and meditate, that he silently recited a prayer with the aspiration to help others to find the path to enlightenment. And for me, This is a very moving thought to imagine this 25-year-old young Sangharakshita. We have a photo of him on the shrine, so later you could come up and see, and I think it must be around that time. So this young monk sitting there and aspiring to be of service and wishing that people around the globe might find their way to the Buddha's teaching. And then reflecting what has arisen from that sincere aspiration. So if you look around this room today, or if you look around our community, I mean, it's a global Buddhist community with centers around the world and 3,000 order members. So all arose from that prayer at the Vulture's Peak more than 75 years ago. And the Vulture Peak, the hill that Sangharakshita visited, had probably quite a different feel to it than the place we visited 75 years later. So I talked to some people who went there only 30 years ago, and they told me that at that time it was still so isolated and lonely that they needed police protection to go up there as a foreigner. But today it's very crowded with tourists, and there's a constant stream of Buddhists of all shapes arriving at the peak. And under those conditions, it can be a bit of a challenge to open the door to another dimension and to connect with this place more as an inner place that exists in the imagination rather than a very concrete place in time and space. But when we went up there, I did manage to find a moment of contemplation, and I sat there and internally recited the Heart Sutra. Which felt meaningful, connecting with those texts. But to my surprise, the strongest moment did not happen at the peak, but when we sat for a few minutes in one of the caves on the way up. So there are a few small caves where, according to legend, the disciples of the Buddha had practiced. And for that very short meditation, I had a very vivid sense of the presence of the Buddha Amitayus, which is the red Buddha of infinite light, love, and life. And I could feel this presence visually and somatically, but I also had the sense that he communicated his presence by perfuming the air with a very sweet scent. So this was an experience that stayed with me, and it also became important further on the journey. And when I prepared for this talk and read through Bhante's description of his visit of Vulture Peak again, he reminded me that there is indeed a very famous sutra that teaches the meditation of the Buddha Amitayus that the Buddha is said to have taught to the Queen of Magadha at the foot of Vulture Peak. And I really love these coincidences that can happen on these journeys, because this is what over time creates resonance and meaning. And I think, I really want to look into this text now, and I think it will have a different meaning now that I have this experience and resonance with that place. So the third place I want to talk about is further north in the foothills of the Himalayas. And very shortly after his visit to Vulture Peak, Sangharakshita found himself in a town called Kalimpong in the Indian Himalayas, very, very close to the Tibetan border. And he was still traveling around with his teacher, Yaktish Kashyap. And his teacher had been invited to visit this place, and they spent 3 weeks in the cool climate of the Himalayas, and what Sangharakshita thought was a holiday. And one morning, he suddenly found his teacher leaving on his own, and he was already in the car and just waving goodbye to Sangharakshita. And he told him to stay in Kalimpong to work for the good of Buddhism. And he was just about to leave. And I think this came quite as a surprise even as a shock to Sangharakshita. But a bit before that, he had taken up a practice to follow the advice and guidance that he received from his teacher. So in some way, he couldn't really, he just decided to not question this, this task and development, and respond to it creatively. And this event became a major turning point on Sangharakshita's journey. And he ended up staying in Kalimpong for 14 years, which were very formative years for him and also very happy ones. But of course, it was absolutely not easy for him, especially at the beginning. It was very challenging for him to find conditions in which he could work for the good of Buddhism. Just imagine a very young monk, a stranger, just being ordained for a few months. Kalimpong at that time was a cultural melting pot with a mix of very interesting people from different Asian countries, but also many Westerners. I mean, this was just only a few years after India became independent. There were also a number of Buddhists in Kalimpong around that time, but Sangharakshita found that he didn't really fit in the existing Buddhist establishment. So in a way, he had to found his own organization, which he did. So he founded the Young Men's Buddhist Association and started offering activities, religious as well as social and cultural, for the young men in Kalimpong. And by doing that, I think he gained himself respect, and he became a respected teacher in Kalimpong. But what he did not know when he arrived there in 1950 was that only very few years later, Kalimpong would see a large influx of Tibetan refugees due to the Chinese invasion. And this provided a unique opportunity for Sangharakshita, because he could develop friendships and connections with some very eminent and respected Tibetan teachers who came to Kalimpong to live there for some years or stay there or just pass through. So over those years, he met many teachers, and at the end he had 8 main teachers, and 7 out of those he met during his time in Kalimpong. So one of them was Chinese, who lived as a hermit in Kalimpong and practiced Chan Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism. But the other 6 were Tibetans and belonged to different schools of Tibetan Buddhism. And when I visited Kalimpong last year, so it was also our next step on the journey from Vulture's Peak to Kalimpong, together with my partner Karunara, I was quite surprised to find that some of the places where Sangharakshita in those years had very important encounters with his teachers that were important for him, and that he had written very detailed in his memoirs about those places. And quite a few of these places are still there, and you can go there and visit them. In general, of course, I think Kalimpong is a very different city from how Sangharakshita experienced the town when he lived there. So at that time, it was probably still quite idyllic, with very beautiful clear skies and views of the Himalayas, the Mount Kanchenjunga that he could see from the window of his place. Today, Kalimpong is very densely populated and has lots of ecological problems, including air pollution. And when we were there, there was no question of a view of the mountains, unfortunately, so just thick smog. And that seems to be the situation most of the time of the year. And I want to describe one place that we visited that was of very special significance to Sangharakshita. And it is the place where, after 7 years in Kalimpong, he finally founded his own small monastery or vihara. And today, this bungalow, this place with a garden around it, it belongs to a family of Tibetan origin who bought this place directly from Sangharakshita after he had decided to move back to the UK permanently. And when we visited, there were other Triratna Buddhists and order members visiting at the same time, and two of our friends were staying at this place privately. So we had the very good fortune to go and visit them there. And it is a very special place on many different layers. So one thing that makes it spiritually important is that Sangharakshita received the name for this monastery from his teacher, Chatra Sangye Dorje Rinpoche, who was one of the most well-respected Tibetan masters of the 20th century. And Sangharakshita met him in 1957 and received from him an initiation into the Green Tara practice, a meditation practice that involves visualizing a green female archetypal form of awakening that is usually connected with compassion and fearlessness. And so this marked Sangharakshita's initiation into Vajrayana practice. So before that, he had been a Theravadan monk with a strong interest also in Mahayana scriptures and texts. But from that moment, in 1957, he also started to practice Vajrayana meditation, which involves visualization of different archetypal Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And so a few days after he received this practice, Chatra Rinpoche visited Sangharakshita, and he told him about his wish to establish his own monastery. And Chatra Rinpoche told him that he would very soon find a suitable place for this endeavor, and that he should call his monastery Triyana Vardhana Vihara, the place where the three yanas flourish. So the three yanas are the Theravada or Hinayana, the Mahayana and Vajrayana, and they represent the three phases of the development of Indian Buddhism over the course of 1,500 years. And I find this significant because this also already expressed a vision that would later become a central and very unique characteristic of Sangharakshita's approach. So when he came back to the West, he was very clear from the beginning that he would base his teaching on the entire Buddhist tradition, and this is also one of the principles on which he founded our community. So our approach to Buddhism is non-sectarian, and collectively we draw inspiration from the entire Buddhist tradition, which of course may mean that individually some order members may be more drawn to early Buddhism, some more to Far Eastern Buddhism, and others more to Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. But in some way, and this place in Kalimpong, it was already the precursor on a small scale for the movement that we are now. And the Triyana Vardhana Vihara was also spiritually significant for another reason. So towards the end of his time in India, in 1962, Sangharakshita was initiated into the practice of Padmasambhava by his teacher Kachu Rinpoche. And this initiation took place in the shrine room of Sangharakshita's monastery. And Padmasambhava was a figure that by that time was already very important for Sangharakshita, and it has been an important figure in the collective spiritual life of our community and order. And so what made him so important? The Buddha himself never traveled to Kalimpong and the Himalayas during his lifetime. It took more than 1,000 years until Buddhism spread to this part of the world. And the dissemination of Buddhism in this region is very much connected with the figure of Padmasambhava. So he was a great Indian Vajrayana master who lived in the 8th century. And he traveled around the many different Himalayan kingdoms and finally to Tibet to spread the Dharma. And Tibetan Buddhists therefore call Padmasambhava the second Buddha, because it is through him that they came in contact with the teachings of the Buddha. And to me, it felt very significant to be able to sit and meditate for a while in the room that used to be Sangharakshita's shrine room and internally connect with that special moment in his life. So Padmasambhava is also a figure that is very close to my heart and who's very present in my meditation. And of course, my own connection with Padmasambhava could only arise because he was initiated into this practice and held it close to his heart. So in some ways, there's a kind of chain reaction that connects my life with Sangharakshita's life. And going on a pilgrimage to places like that offers the opportunity of going closer to the source of that chain of inspiration. And maybe in the future, the Triratna Buddhist Vihara will be a place of pilgrimage. The family who own the place, they are thinking about building some huts around the original building that would allow small groups of Triratna Buddhists to come and stay there and practice together in the main house. And I mean, that's an idea that's around, but I don't know if they're following up on this idea. But I think it would be truly wonderful if this opportunity existed. And people could go there and connect with this important place in the history of our community. So we have the story of the Buddha's awakening. His example inspired countless others to follow him and find liberation from suffering as he did. And thereby his teaching spread all over Asia over the course of the centuries. And roughly 150 years ago, Buddhism also started to spread to Europe, which allowed Sangharakshita to find Buddhist texts translated into English and start his own journey in search of the Buddha and his experience of awakening. So that's what motivated him to go to India. And when he came back to the West, he shared the inspiration he found there, out of which arose this community. And this allowed me, 50 years after Sangharakshita came back to the West, to find the Buddha's teaching here in Berlin, in Kreuzberg. And another 10 years later, wanting to go on a pilgrimage to India. So in that way, you can see that all our stories are intimately interwoven. Without the Buddha, Sangharakshita's journey would not have taken place. Without the Buddha and Sangharakshita's journey, my own journey would not have taken place. And so personally connecting my life to the lives of Sangharakshita and his teachers and other practitioners down to the time of the Buddha is what gives my life a lot of meaning. And it is what Buddhists have done over the course of the centuries and somehow thereby created what we call Sangha, the community of practitioners. So to finish, I just want to share a few thoughts about pilgrimage as a practice. Because for me, going on a pilgrimage has become an important part of my practice. And I feel that it is a possibility to tap into a deeper source of inspiration and to contact that layer and bring more of it to life after I come back. And the two journeys to India and Nepal that I did over the past years have helped me to relate to the Buddhist tradition in a different way and to see what we're doing here from a much wider perspective. And I feel it's very helpful that there are places that have been visited by Buddhists over the centuries. And somehow we can connect to the experience that the people made by visiting those places and thereby come closer to the experience of the Buddha, come closer to the Buddha himself. And the value for my life is not only that I've visited these places outwardly. I find that the value is much more that these outer places become part of my inner life and that they come alive in my imagination and thereby become a resource that I can draw from and also reconnect in my meditation. And I have been reflecting on a few qualities that I think you need if you want to go on a pilgrimage. And first of all, I think a quality you really need is faith. So you need to have faith that what you find on that journey will be valuable. It will be meaningful. It will be life-changing. So if you go on a journey with a skeptical or cynical mind, all you will find are crowded touristic places that are probably unpleasantly hot or cold, dusty and smelly, and very uncomfortable. So in some ways you need faith, and you need openness to relate to whatever you encounter, to be open to new experiences, and to allow something that goes beyond what you can currently imagine. And of course, going into that unknown also requires fearlessness, because coming into contact with the unforeseen, something that maybe even might cause us to change, will very likely cause an emotional response of fear, because we cannot control the situation. We need courage to confront it. And you also need an ability to see beyond. You need to be able to connect with something deeper, something that goes beyond what is just there, that you can perceive with the senses. Maybe something more archetypal. And also it requires some understanding and knowledge of the tradition and maybe the value of the places, how it was valuable to people who've been there before, in order to be able to appreciate the importance of a place and to open up to its influence. And I think for me that was my experience on Vulture Peak, that I could connect to the place and have an experience because I knew that it was connected to so many texts that I value and cherish. But sometimes also something can happen very unexpectedly, like that experience of Amitayus in the cave that I had. And of course I had no idea about the connection with Amitayus at that moment. And another quality or another thing that is important, is crucially important, is timing on a journey like that, because you never know whom you will meet and who will be there. So you go, and of course there are a lot of conditions coming together, and you might meet somebody, you might have an encounter that will change your life. You don't know it. It's not in your control. And in some ways this you can't do anything about it, but what you can do is somehow to surrender to a flow of things. So really let go of your plans and concrete ideas of how things should be and of the outcome. So you can surrender to the flow of things and let what you do next arise more naturally and spontaneously and organically. And I think when you surrender to that flow, then the timing will also be right, and you might have the encounters that change your life. And entering into this flow requires trust, especially trust in yourself, in your own mission, that it is valuable and meaningful to be on that journey. And you also need to stay in touch with your deeper aspiration and motivation. So on one level, you need openness to change, but you also need to stay in touch with your deeper motivation. Otherwise, you might just be carried away by things. So it's really important that there's something, some thread that you not let go of. And to me, these qualities are qualities that we need not only if we want to go on a pilgrimage to India. We need them on the journeys of our lives if we aim to live meaningful lives. And you do not need to travel far away to practice these qualities. So last year, for example, there was a group of people who made a 4-day pilgrimage, walking from this place here to our future retreat center, 80 kilometers north, the Rote Burg. And I was not part of the group, but I was part of the group who welcomed them when they arrived. And you could really see when they got there after 4 days of walking that this experience was profoundly transformative, and that a lot what arose during that journey was not planned, and something really meaningful happened. And you don't even need to go on an outward journey. So in February I went, I planned a 3-week solitary. And while I was there in meditation, I reflected that somehow the same principles apply. So if you go on this inward journey, you also never know what will happen and what appears in your experience. So you need to have faith and to be fearless, because what comes up in your mind might be frightening. You also need to be open to see beyond, to see the deeper meaning of what's happening for your life. And you also need to trust the flow and need trust and connect with your aspiration. But you need also to respond to the unforeseen. So on my solitary, I had spent 10 days in very deep meditation, and there were another almost 2 weeks left, and suddenly there was a knock on the door, and I completely didn't expect that. And then there was a person coming in, organizing the place, telling me that they had just received a phone call that my grandma had had a stroke and that she was in hospital and it looked like she was going to die. So I was sitting there and I needed to respond to this, and I needed to take a decision. And I decided then after 2 days I would go home and just respond to what needed to be done and spend time with them. And so the journey required me to respond outwardly, and at the end it was a really positive experience, and I still felt it was one retreat over 3 years, even though some bit was inwardly and some bit was outwardly. But you also do not need to go on a solitary. You can bring the attitude of pilgrimage to each meditation session. So just encounter whatever comes up with a fresh mind. And if we do that, then over time we can see our whole life as a pilgrimage, a journey that brings us closer step by step to the experience of the Buddha, the experience that the Buddha had in Bodh Gaya under the Bodhi tree 2,500 years ago. And on that journey, our very own journey to the seat of awakening, we will find more and more freedom from suffering and develop an increasingly stronger taste of the infinite wisdom and compassion and the boundless creativity of the awakened mind. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this talk, you are warmly invited to visit Buddhist Dishes Tour Berlin in Kreuzberg. We offer meditation, Dharma talks, and courses that support practice in everyday life. You'll find more information in the episode description.